Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Cundas-Craig, the Acting Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and Environment, while my colleague Bob Kiter is on sabbatical. We're happy today to have back Jordan Fisher-Smith to talk about his book, Engineering Eden. But I wanted to thank, before we get going, the Cultural Vision Fund that has provided funding for lectures such as this one, as well as a lot of the other Stegner Center events, including our symposium, our lecture series, and our Young Scholar program. I also wanted to mention, if you didn't see outside, King's English Bookshop is here selling copies of Engineering Eden, and Mr. Smith will be available after his talk to sign those copies if you are so inclined. And finally, a list of Stegner events in our calendar is available outside of the auditorium, so please feel free to pick it up, but it's also available on our website. So, again, we're happy to welcome back Jordan Fisher-Smith, who's worked for 21 years as a park and wilderness ranger in California, Wyoming, Idaho, and Alaska. We had him here for his first book, Nature Noir, which has won several awards, and we are happy to have him back for Engineering Eden, the story of a trial against the National Park Service for death by grizzly bear. So we look forward to hearing him talk about this book. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Before I forget to ask, is anybody here from Nancy McLaughlin's Estates and Trusts class? Good, okay. I wanted to make sure I wasn't judged on estates and trusts. First of all, I want to thank you, Robin, for that introduction, and thanks to Bob Kiter and to Jan Nystrom for making all the wonderful arrangements so easy for me to in the last few months. And to Jim and Nancy McLaughlin for being my hosts while I'm here. It's a treat to be here as the year ripens. You know, in my life is a little bit like going around and seeing old friends, but also of the non-human variety. You know, I see got a chance to check in on the Gamble's Oaks on the Wasatch Front, which are just beginning to turn that kind of russet color and the bright orange of the big tooth maples that just like flames up on the hills, and then farther up the aspens turning lemon yellow, and these mountain ash branches, heavy with those great umbels of red orange berries, and these are many of these plants are familiar to me from all over the Rocky Mountains, and so it's just like seeing Jim and Nancy. It's like seeing old friends, and then the white pelicans flying from Gunnison Island toward the Gulf, and hawks migrating, and some 5 billion birds headed south from the United States to Central and South America. We are not alone. Wendell Berry said, every life has all lives for its delight. I guess of all the talks I've done and will do with Engineering Eden, this one in a moot courtroom at a law school with an audience that includes a number of law scholars and professors of law, eminent ones, inspires in me the sort of strange mixture of pride and the kind of most abject humility. And I'm grateful to you for being here. I guess I've spent a fair amount of time in courtrooms, and in my work as a park ranger, I came to know portions of the law, state and federal laws, civil and criminal laws, as a driver would know automotive engineering. I can write a pretty good affidavit for a search warrant, and I have spent in my strange and diverse career 14 years as a certified instructor of the use of force. So I twist in discomfort lately as I watch YouTube videos of cops shooting a man without a clear ability to articulate the lawful elements of what they're doing, because there aren't any. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The law is the witness and external deposit of our moral life. It is the history of the moral development of the race." Just so, in my book, Engineering Eden, Yellowstone National Park becomes, which was the first and oldest national park in the world, becomes the external deposit or embodiment of our ecological development. Yellowstone was designated in 1872, which is a peculiarly American invention that Wallace Stegner himself famously said was the best idea we ever had. But that 1872 was kind of also a paradoxically modern, yet in some ways backward kind of time. Both are present at that moment. On the one hand, you have this very technologically proficient and sophisticated civilization that has managed to lay a large telegraph cable across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean from Ireland to Nova Scotia, which then connects the stock markets and reinsurance markets of London and New York, allowing speculation at the speed of electrons, a virtual internet, really, connecting the continents like at the speed of electrons. This was done, by the way, by unspooling the cable from a 700-foot-long iron steamship. Today's guided missile cruisers are somewhere around the high 600s or 700 feet long. And yet it was also, in other ways, a very primitive civilization. 1872 was 4 years before Custer's last stand. This civilization was infantile in its relationship with indigenous people and notably with nature. At the time that Yellowstone was created, the science of ecology had not been invented yet as a distinct field. This happens around the 1890s, and the Ecological Society of America is present by the First World War. Ecology doesn't really show up in human affairs until about the same time as nuclear physics, which is awfully late for the good of both us and the world that we ended up interacting with. By about 1960, there was enough ecological sophistication to understand that these national parks, the early ones, had become these physical embodiments or sort of kindergartens for ecological learning, and that if you know what to look for to this day, you can see the various stages of our development, just as Oliver Wendell Holmes said about the law, embodied in the actual physical landscape of the parks. By 1960s, there was a sense that people understood how wrong things had gone. They had managed to wipe out every wolf in Yellowstone by 1926. Cougars weren't seen for most of the 20th century. Bears had been spared because they were interesting for the public to watch. People found them fascinating and funny. An early loss of large numbers of ungulates was followed by an attempt to restore ungulate herds, which then grew beyond the capacity of the park to support them. And there was damage to vegetation. And from about 1890 on, both grizzly bears and black bears had started feeding at garbage dumps, which were located near every habitation. And people were also feeding them first from wagons and later from automobiles. And feeding black bears became an expected and favorite part of visit to any national park in the West. It was sort of quasi-legal. The rangers looked the other way, and many people were injured by black bears, not initially by grizzly bears. In the 1960s, there were attempts to renaturalize the national parks. Notable in this book, Engineering Eden, is a guy named Starker Leopold, who was the son of Aldo Leopold, and in his time was probably the most, as far as net policy, government policy and so on, in biological matters, he was probably the most powerful biologist in America at that time. And with his guidance, the National Park Service set out to try to restore parks to naturalness. I want to tip you off that, of course, in this book, Engineering Eden, the National Park stands in for the whole world. So, it's hard to talk about what are we going to do about the whole world or the environmental crisis. It's easier for a writer to tell a story about what happened in a park, which is a sort of physical manifestation of our relationship with nature. So the parks, and the book contains not only a story about Yellowstone, but extends into Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon and Glacier National Parks, all first-line, old, great parks. These parks represent this struggle that we have now about what do we do from here on. When we break nature, how do we fix it? In the process of fixing it, how much autonomy do we grant nature? Do we believe that we're now, just because we have hijacked the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, as you may know, we now control more nitrogen than nature does. More nitrogen is moving through human channels than through nature now, largely in nitrogen fertilizers, but also in waste, animal waste and human waste and so on, and manufacturing. So if we have done these things sort of by accident, do we now grant ourselves permission, or do we think it's necessary to step in and become the engineers of nature? I mean, are we in charge now? Did we accidentally become in charge, and should we just admit it and take control? And then, do we really know enough to be those engineers of nature? Or is whatever remaining autonomy there is in nature our salvation? Do we want to encourage nature's continued autonomy even in this destabilized form? Or should we step in and become its operating engineers? And then what if we get it seriously wrong? And of course, in this story, getting it wrong focuses on a particular death that occurred. By the 1960s, there were sort of two warring forces at Yellowstone and in the national parks. One was the idea that Starker Leopold proposed, which is once things are out of balance, you will really need to be involved to get them back squared away and get back in a form that we will consider provisionally natural. It isn't going to do itself for the most part. The other school of thought was, all of this has come about because we're constantly messing with things. The solution is just to stop messing with things. Make some immediate adjustments to remove blots on the landscape that obviate our wrong involvement, and then step back and let it balance itself. So what happens is that the Park Service at that time at Yellowstone National Park comes under the care of a biologist who believes that nature will balance itself. And they go about trying to stop messing with the number of elk, which they had been doing for much of the 20th century. Because they killed off predators and elk had gotten to be, as they saw it, too many, they began shooting them by the thousands and shipping them out on first trains and then trucks all over the United States to replenish herds elsewhere. So we're going to stop that, and we're definitely going to stop bears feeding in dumps. So we're going to bulldoze dirt over the dumps. In the summer of 1972, a young man named Harry Eugene Walker left his home in Alabama and went on sort of the Great American Road Trip. And 72, there were a lot of people doing that. The roads were full of people with backpacks and cardboard signs with destinations on them, and every freeway on-ramp there were hitchhikers. It was the summer that this song "Take It Easy" came out, the Eagles song, with this kind of open road, upbeat song of freedom and that kind of banjo-infused harmonies, and a guy standing on a corner in Winslow, Arizona, and a girl in a Ford slows down to pick him up. And really in a time now when we see maybe one hitchhiker every once in a while, and they're probably a mental health case, it was a different world. And so Harry's on the road. He ends up going east as far as New York. He goes west to the Rocky Mountains. He heads up the Rocky Mountains, and on the day after the summer solstice, he is hitchhiking in Livingston, Montana, and a girl in a Ford slows down and picks him up. And he meets the woman that he probably would have married had he not died 2.5 days later at Yellowstone. Harry unknowingly walks into the middle of this great argument about how to make nature natural again. At this point, they have stopped shooting large numbers of elk to control the effects of having lost predators. They're trying to let elk equilibrate themselves with the environment. They had been still trapping some up until 1967. They are experimenting with putting fire back. That year, the superintendent allowed the first lightning strike to burn. They are trying to close the dumps as an embarrassment in time for the festivities celebrating the centennial of Yellowstone. And there's a big festival going on around Harry as he comes to the park. They're dedicating a new visitor center at Old Faithful. There's a huge conference of park professionals and scientists from all over the world, 84 nations coming there that fall to talk about how to manage parks. And the superintendent wants this park to be an example of, how we're pushing back the park to naturalness. And Harry walks into the middle of all of that. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll read you a little selection from this book. I should say that this is not, those of you who are law scholars here, this is not a policy book. It's not an argument in favor or against something. It is not a history. I'm not a historian, although it contains a lot of history, and I believe most of it's right. It is not fiction. It is what we call narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction sounds or reads sometimes like a novel. Unfortunately, the author has to make sure that everything that's in there is true, including what people say when they open their mouths. We will interview people and have sources about what the person said at that moment, or we use transcripts. In this case, I was lucky to have 1,745 pages of trial transcripts and endless depositions and all sorts of other things, along with a good many people who were still alive and remembered the events of the summer of 1972 really well. So I'm going to read to you a little passage. You'll see Harry is still at home in Alabama. Hasn't left yet, and he's sort of struggling with the weight of primogeniture, which this idea that the oldest son or the only son will inherit the farm and is sort of from birth groomed to take over the business. This weighed heavy on Harry Walker. He was going to take over a marginal dairy farm in Alabama. He was working really hard. The farm wasn't paying him enough, and he was working side jobs all the time. And so he's in a state of trying to figure out what to do with himself. And at Yellowstone, you'll meet the ranger who ends up investigating Harry's death, a guy named Jim Brady. And Jim is sort of your classic ranger. And you will see Jim in the beginning, or fairly close to the beginning, involved in herding elk into corrals so they can be put on trucks and shipped to other places to get rid of excess elk, reduce damage on vegetation, and restore herds for Fish and Game agencies in other states. There will be reference to the chief biologist who has this naturalness program by the name of Glenn Cole. and the superintendent of the park, who is solidly on the side of just for once, let's just step back and let it be. We've done all these things and they've all come to naught, and now we're going to solve it by pushing some dirt over the dumps very quickly, getting out of the elk business and stepping and allowing fire to do its work and letting nature equilibrate, which is all fine and good, but the question is, how quickly can nature adjust to our reforming ourselves in this case? By 1970, Harry Walker had become a familiar face at the Smokehouse, a brick-fronted billiards hall with front windows looking out on the main business street of Anniston, half a block from the white marble courthouse, where Assistant U.S. Attorney Spivak later took depositions from the Alabama witnesses in Harry's death. He was a grown man now, 23, 6'1", long and lean, all muscle and gristle, with a ready smile that showed his big, even, white teeth. Oh, you know what I thought at that moment? I thought, oh my God, it's my phone. That was what everybody thinks, right? I mean, it's okay as long as it's not my phone. He dressed in blue jeans, tight white T-shirts, and tight white T-shirts that his mother kept bleached, and plaid shirts. He liked to shoot pool, but the Smokehouse was also a part of a mosaic of side jobs he cobbled together for extra income. Although he worked long hours on his father's farm, the dairy didn't clear enough to pay him a full salary. So in addition to the Smokehouse at various times, Harry worked the night shift at a pipe foundry, spent a couple of weeks on an oil rig off the Gulf Coast, and crewed on a shrimp boat out of Mobile. Based on his experience with farm machines, the National Guard trained him as a heavy equipment operator, and he brokered this skill into yet another job running a backhoe for an Anniston construction company. When the mail carrier on the Walker's rural route was looking for a substitute for vacations and sick days, he asked Harry. Harry applied and got that job too. Harry's life was laid out before him, like the cows that had worn their habitual trails in the red clay from the lower pastures to the milking barn. Harry would mark the years of his life treading the same paths his daddy did, and at least for now, he would have to work all those side jobs as well. At Yellowstone, that spring of 1970, a newly appointed 30-year-old sub-district ranger was sent down from Mammoth Hot Springs to take over the day-to-day operations at Old Faithful Village. Jim Brady was not a big man, but he had played college football, and he exuded physical confidence. His manner was thoughtful, polite, and deferential. He had a way of making people feel like they had his total attention when they spoke to him. And among his subordinates, he had a reputation for being preternaturally cool in emergencies. Brady had grown up in San Bernardino, where the smog drifting east from Los Angeles met the dust and tumbleweeds of the Mojave Desert. His father was a brakeman for the Santa Fe Railroad there, and when Brady was 14, his old man was hit by a train and put out of work. As the family slipped into poverty, Brady discovered football, which earned him an athletic scholarship at Humboldt State University in the coastal rainforests of Northern California. In addition to lumber mills and muddy scrimmages, Humboldt was known for turning out foresters and wildlife biologists. Brady majored in botany and zoology and married his high school sweetheart. By the time he graduated in 1962, he was working as a seasonal park ranger and very much wanted to be a permanent one. That summer, his wife gave birth to their first child at Yellowstone National Park. Brady's specialty within the Park Service, as opposed to a scientist such as Glenn Cole or a ranger naturalist, whose job was to give out information to visitors and teach people about nature, was to make sure the coming and going of millions of visitors went smoothly and to see to it that they went home in one piece. In the early 1960s, when Brady came on the scene, the Park Service was diversifying its traditional fare of awe-inspiring scenery with new parks where the emphasis was on pure outdoor recreation. Brady got his first permanent job in 1963 at one of these units, Lake Mead, the reservoir formed by the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Just outside of Las Vegas, Lake Mead National Recreation Area was a 24-hour bacchanal of alcohol, high-powered boats, firearms, and assorted other weapons. It was a gladiator school for young law enforcement rangers. By the time he transferred back to Yellowstone in November of 1967, Brady had been shot at 3 times. About the first thing they found for him to do when he got back to Yellowstone was to fly around the Lamar Valley as an observer in a helicopter, chasing elk through the snow into winged fences and corrals that by then were referred to, not so affectionately, as McGee traps. McGee was a senator from Wyoming who didn't want the Park Service to shoot elk because it might affect the number of elk available to hunters when they migrated out of the park into the national forests. And the rangers had to exert quite a bit more energy to trap an elk than just to drop it with a rifle. They were pretty upset about being forced to do this. After the beating the Park Service had taken in Senator McGee's hearing that March, they weren't shooting any elk, and as Glenn Cole, the chief biologist, implemented natural control, he called it, it was the last time they would give them away, 984 of them that winter. From the helicopter, beneath a ceiling of snow clouds, the Lamar Valley was a study in blue, gray, and black, and orange where a shaft of low sun stole under the weather to light a distant peak. It had been snowing, and the icy wind had blown the powder off the ridges and into the gullies and low spots where it settled in hundreds of parallel paths that generations of elk had engraved into the mountainsides in their desperate search for sustenance. The elk trails stood out as white lines against the stony slopes, like the contours of a topographic map. The helicopter shook as the pilot swooped back and forth, herding strings of elk through the deep snow into the gullies. After the mayhem in Las Vegas, for Brady, this was like coming home, and from the tiny bubble-canopied craft, the immensity of the valley and the white elk paths were beautiful, and it all looked convincingly like wilderness. Brady made a good account of himself in 1968 and 1969 in the North District at Mammoth Hot Springs, and in 1970 he was made the Old Faithful Subdistrict Ranger. Old Faithful Village is located along the Grand Loop Road in the valley of the Firehole River in the western part of Yellowstone. The meadows surrounding it are bounded on the east by the timbered ridge of Observation Point and on the west by the dark lava bluffs at the eastern edge of the Madison Plateau. In those days, the village contained some 400 buildings, the greater number of them tiny brown-painted guest cabins and small structures. The ruling presences were 2 large historic hotels on the north end, facing a semicircular blank causeway around an aperture from which, at intervals of just over an hour, the Old Faithful geyser erupted over 100 feet in the air. Beyond the geyser, paths and boardwalks extended north into the upper geyser basin and up the rounded white slope of Geyser Hill. The hill and the valley in the distance were dotted with clouds of steam rising from geysers and hot pools. The Grand Loop Road had been constructed by Army engineers in the early days as a dirt wagon track. By 1970, it was a 142-mile strip of asphalt, 22 feet wide, connecting Old Faithful to the other clusters of hotels, cabins, stores, cafes, visitor centers, marinas, and campgrounds in the park. These features constituted less than 5% of Yellowstone's total area, but absorbed over 95% of the rangers' energy. A project to divert the road around Old Faithful Village was completed for the centennial summer of 1972. But when Jim Brady took over in 1970, on an average summer day between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, from 600 to 800 cars, trucks, buses, and motorhomes rolled right through the village. At intervals of about 65 minutes, when the geyser went off, drivers of passing cars would stop in the middle of the road, everyone would pile out with their cameras, and the Grand Loop Road would become gridlocked in both directions. There was no getting a patrol car or an ambulance through, and as one of his first administrative actions, Brady put in a request for a motorcycle. Vehicle fires, forest fires, lost children and pets, fist fights over parking places or other imagined slights, spousal disputes, thefts, and the delivery of emergency messages to call home about the death of an aunt were all part of Brady's job. Brady's life was a strange juxtaposition of quiet, sage-scented moments watching elk and bison grazing slowly across the meadows, and other moments that embodied the whole intense pageant of human existence, from birth to sudden death. In June of 1970, he found himself stepping gingerly toward the edge of a pool of boiling hot water in the upper geyser basin with a rope around his waist, held by another ranger, and carrying a bucket of strong soap. A 9-year-old boy walking through the geysers with his family had stumbled off the boardwalk and fallen into the pool. His mother and father heard the splash and turned round to see him surface with a shocked expression, then sink and die. He was boiled until the meat fell off his bones. It had been known since the turn of the century, when it was done for the entertainment of tourists, that the soaping of hot springs caused them to bubble more violently. This action caused what was left of the boy to rise to the surface, where Brady and his rangers skimmed about 8 pounds of the remains for burial. With all of that, the second stage of Anderson and Cole's closure plan made things twice as bad at Old Faithful that year. The bears displaced by food reductions at Trout Creek Dump, which had been closed the previous year, awoke that spring to find workers bulldozing dirt over Rabbit Creek Dump and installing an electrified fence around a temporary landfill at Nez Perce Creek, a couple of miles north. There were no power lines there, so a generator ran 24 hours a day, and a maintenance worker was assigned to monitor it. Alone out there at night, he witnessed huge grizzlies getting sparked off the fence, and as Brady understood it, he was so unnerved by the experience that he refused to go back. Meanwhile, in a cooperative effort with the state of Montana to keep grizzlies off garbage along Yellowstone's boundaries, the town dump of West Yellowstone was closed for that summer. However, as Steven Zetterberg, who's the lawyer who takes on the family's case about the death of the federal case about the death of Harry Walker. As Steven Zetterberg forced Starker Leopold to admit during his cross-examination, bears did not respond by suddenly switching to an all-natural diet. June of 1970 was exactly 2 months long, Brady remembered. Brady and his rangers spent their days dealing with people and their nights dealing with grizzlies. Scattered in the pines on the south side of the village was the housing for Park Service and concession employees. At night, grizzlies wandered the unlit gravel roads there, past the dormitories, houses, and trailers, looking for something to eat. So Brady and his rangers were setting culvert traps, tranquilizing the bears, and relocating them. Toward the 4th of July weekend in 1970, a trap was set right in front of Brady's trailer. One night, he was awakened by the sound of the steel gate clanging shut. Luckily, his wife and 3 little girls were up at Mammoth Hot Springs at the time. It was about 2 a.m. He got up, looked out the front window to where the porch light cast a pool of light around the trap, and sure enough, it was sprung. Grizzlies mate between May and July, and Brady knew that around that time, if you trapped a female, there might be a male nearby. He got on the phone and woke up Mike Warren, a bear management ranger, and asked him to get in his patrol car and drive through the housing area to see if there were any other grizzlies around. Warren drove around, spotlighting the woods for about 15 minutes, then radioed an all clear and pulled up in front of Brady's trailer. Brady came out to meet him, leaving the trailer door ajar as the screen door sprung shut. The two of them peered into the trap and saw a sow that they'd handled before. Suddenly Warren said, "Run!" Both men sprinted for the safety of the trailer, dove underneath the porch railing, and tumbled right through the closed screen door, demolishing it. Brady slammed the trailer door behind them as a big male bear attacked the porch in frustration, and then went over to the trap with the female inside and started banging on it with his paws. Brady got out a dart pistol, sat down at the kitchen table, and loaded the dart with enough Sacostrin to put down a big bear or instantly kill a human being. His hands were shaking with the adrenaline. As he finished loading the pistol, he accidentally discharged it. The dart missed Warren and lodged in the ceiling. Brady loaded another, walked over to the door, cracked it open, and darted the big male with the first shot. The bear ran off into the darkness. We often had that problem when I was working with bears, is that sometimes they would run away. when you didn't give them quite enough drug. Brady and Warren got into Warren's car and drove around the housing area looking for the bear. Time went by, long enough for the animal to have been immobilized and then come to again. Finally, they saw a light on in a small travel trailer and heard a woman screaming. The bear was up against the side of the trailer, trying to turn it over. Brady darted it again. This time it went straight down. The two rangers went back to anesthetize the trapped female bear and towed the trap containing her over to the second bear. They woke up a couple of other rangers who tried to drag the big male into the trap, but it was too heavy. So they went to get a pickup with an electric winch, snaked the cable through the trap, past the sow, winched the male in next to her, and slammed the gate. The 6-year-old male had been transplanted twice before and was sent to a zoo. Brady isn't sure what happened to the sow. That was how it was at Old Faithful in the summer of 1970. Anderson and Cole had ordered dump closure to proceed, and Brady was determined to make it through the year without a serious bear incident at Old Faithful. He almost did, or maybe he actually did. We may never know, because amid the daily chaos and all the good deeds of the Rangers that summer, key evidence thought to be fragmentary human remains was mishandled and lost, and although Jim Brady could not have known it, the old grizzly that would later kill Harry Walker passed through his hands. I'd like to have a little time for discussion with you all, but I will say that one more thing. If you've read any of the reviews of this book, people have remarked on the form of the book. And I should say that one of the things that came to me as I was working on it was that I decided that I wanted the form of the book to resemble the net of relationships in nature or in ecology. And I found that we've all been sold at one time or another in maybe in elementary school or high school what's called the great man theory of history, which is that there are these sort of effusions of brilliance that suddenly appear among us. And do the great things, whether they're a king or an emperor or a great composer or artist or a writer. And it's been my observation, at least in my own life, that much of what happens is through connection with other people. And that as far as I'm concerned in my writing life, much of what I've been doing has been influenced by and inspired by people, all kinds of people like Jim McLaughlin, people like Bob Kiter, people that I meet and work with and talk to and correspond with. And so for me, human affairs really does resemble ecology, or what was called in the Sanskrit tradition, Indra's net, the infinitely complex relationships of one to another. However, for the most part, this has been done away with for narrative convenience by writers and playwrights. Otherwise, people will say, there's just too many characters, there's too many things going on, and I can't keep track of them. But I did in this book attempt to portray life as I actually believe it is. I noticed this saying on the wall from Martin Luther King, and King also said, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. Farther back, even Herman Melville says, we cannot live only for ourselves. 1,000 fibers connect us with our fellow men. And among those fibers, as sympathetic threads, our actions run as causes and come back to us as effects. So I tried to make this book, in describing the arc of ecology in the 20th century and the history of the national parks and the story of Harry Walker, who I tried to make, like my other characters, really come alive and walk around and say stuff that he actually said. I have tried to form this in a formal sense in a book that is like a model of how I believe reality to work. And I think that even in the present presidential election, if somebody comes at you with something that's just really simple, be suspicious of it. reality is complex. Does anybody have any questions about what I'm up to here, or have you ever had any experiences? You live pretty close to this ecosystem. Have any of you had any brushes with grizzly bears or bears and black bears? Yes, sir. You know what I'm going to do here? I'd like to hand you a microphone. Would you be willing to? That way I don't have to repeat your question. And also I should say, and I should have made this announcement, they have seen fit to put 2 microphones here. And if you can walk and you want to come forward, that would be good.
I basically grew up in Yellowstone as a child. We would go there every year for a couple of weeks because my dad was a big fisherman and he'd take his boat up. And we actually were camped at the site of the Hebgen quake the night before.
Oh my.
So,
does everybody know what that was? It was a massive earthquake that killed a bunch of people.
There was a very gorgeous campground underneath what's now a dam.
Yeah, yeah.
But the bear experience was about, somewhere in the neighborhood of 68. And we used to go up and we would feed the bears cookies from our car windows. Just before they
Everybody did.
Just before they stopped doing that. And I remember one very distinctly where my brother, about 16, 17 years old, put his hand out with a cookie, and the bear had his arm up to about here, and my mom grabbed his torso and yanked him, and he had teeth marks running down his arm.
So in the 1950s, there were well over 500 injuries to human beings from black bears in Yellowstone. For a long time, grizzlies, have a different attitude about people than black bears. And thank you for your story. I'm responding to it. The black bears are somewhat gregarious around people and can be easily induced to approach people with proffering food. Grizzlies generally won't be hand-fed. They stay away from people and don't particularly want to hang out with people. But occasionally one of them takes a person. Oftentimes these are things where, for example, the sow with cubs scenario is one of the most common ways that people run into problems. But once if the bear kills a person, then they will sometimes feed on human flesh. And just occasionally a bear will take a human for the purpose of feeding. It doesn't happen much. But most of those things you're talking about where people got their arms messed up were with black bears in hand feeding. And up until they started to try to reform the parks and shut off the supply of human food, really we didn't get a lot of fatalities from bears. It was the shutting off of human food after some 80 years that really led to some very dangerous situations in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the early 90s. It took that long for the situation to get squared away. And I describe in here the invention of the bear box, which was after they closed the dumps. That's a problem. They closed the dumps and hadn't invented these bear boxes that are in every campsite yet, nor had they invented the canister. Thank you for your remarks. I'm glad you still have your arm. Oh, your brother's arm, right. Is that right, your brother? Yeah. Anybody else have a brush with a grizzly? Has anybody ever run into a grizzly on a trail? Well, good for you. And again, I mean, in a 7-year study from 2007 to 2013, in all of the national parks, 4 people died in bear attacks. During that same period of time, well over 300 died in drownings, and well over 200 died in automobile accidents. So, the animals can take us. They just don't mostly. It just doesn't happen that much. However, we are, mentally, I think we're sort of the same creatures that were walking around wrapped in skins, as the glaciers receded, living on flesh, and we are hardwired for the Paleolithic in a way that we fear those things, I did a brief investigation to find out how many snakebite victims there were in all of the national parks during that 7 years, and it turned out that the rate of death from snakebite is the same as choking on hot dogs. It was one case. I wanted to say that, again, that what I've read here is sort of a sample of the way I'm... Oh, sir, go ahead, please.
I apologize for my phone going off. I was trying to actually turn
no,
it off,
I was just,
so it wouldn't do that.
I was so happy it wasn't mine. I mean, I didn't mind as long as it was yours, but I was afraid that I hadn't turned mine off.
Yeah, I'm always frustrated when a bear and human interact with each other negatively, and then the bear is dispatched. How do we feel about that? Is that the only recourse?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in at least one case recently, a bear at Yellowstone was allowed to live after having a conflict with a human being and later killed somebody. And I think that this is, we're standing in the College of Law. It's more of a legal equation that when the park managers decide to let an animal live, they're incurring such a massive responsibility for what happens for the rest of that bear's life. And one of the wonderful things that's happened, is that, and it's leading to this attempt to delist the grizzly in the northern Rockies, that bears are really have been somewhat saved. That in this book we get down to a point where there are below 100 of them in the Yellowstone population, and as you know, that population was genetically pretty much unlinked from the crown of the continent population. We were really in danger of losing the grizzly at the time that this book covers, and now we have some 600 to 1,000 of them between the Wind River Range and the north side of of Yellowstone, and so it certainly is unjust to the individual bear, perhaps, for us to assume that it's a murderer because it killed once. But it is at this point we have enough of them that we're not doing a damage to the species. In the Walker case that I described in this book, there were actually a whole sheaf of letters that came in telling from people that wanted to save the bear. Said it's not the bear's fault. It was the human's fault for being there. People generally feel the way you feel about it, which I like. I mean, we have a good deal of sympathy for wildlife, and we have laws in this country to protect them, which I think is wonderful. Expression of what? Yeah, and that is bears are very smart animals, and they're omnivores, and they have tremendous memories. So bears are known to be quite aware of where they had a certain kind of meal 4 or 5 or 10 years ago, and they'll go back and check it again. And Mary Marr, the wonderful bison biologist emeritus who started her career at Yellowstone in 1959 and is still living there as an emeritus biologist, as a retired person, tells me that she used to go out and look at Trout Creek Dump and Rabbit Creek Dump for years after they were closed. She would find where bears had been digging out there, trying to get down through those bulldozer loads of dirt. They remember, and and it turns out that giving an animal food is one of the strongest ways that you can change an animal's behavior. So these people who were faced with this question of how to make nature natural again really needed to look at it in a more complex way than they did. There were major mistakes made. It is sort of remarkable, as I said before, that they had not developed the bear box. The general feeling was that George Melendez Wright, had suggested the bear box in the 1930s. He said, we have to develop some sort of storage for people's food in the campgrounds. A bear is genetically built to tear apart things and get food. They tear apart logs and get grubs, and they will get whatever they can. It wasn't done, and the general feeling was it would be too expensive, but think how expensive it was to not have them. And of course, this backpacker canister that I described, actually knew one of the guys that was working on that, hadn't been developed either. So they closed these dumps, and the bears just moved closer to where the garbage had come from. They charged into the campgrounds. This book goes into what happened in Yosemite. Yosemite in 1975 was unrecognizable. There were lots and lots of people hurt by bears in Yosemite. I mean, it was a crazy, crazy year there. There was bear incidents right and left with actual attacks on humans. Yes, sir.
What do you think the Park Service is doing now?
Well, the biggest battle, I should say one of the biggest battles with the Park Service was putting the scientists in charge more. That everybody, I think, who's read a little bit about the national parks knows that very early on, the pleasuring ground aspect and the economic aspects, the hotels and so on, sort of took the fore. And there were expressions of concern by the 1920s from ecologists that the parks were not being run as refuges for wildlife; they were being run as, Disneylands. And that went on for a very long time. And Starker Leopold, who Starker is such a fascinating character to me. He's the oldest son of Aldo Leopold. His work and Aldo's are absolutely inextricable. You have to understand these two scientists as sort of one being. Starker, who most of us barely know now, was this incredibly well-known and famous biologist during his life. There's been no biography of Starker. So what Starker was up to was trying to get the scientists a little more in control. They might have been wrong about some things, but decisions in the parks had to be based on science. Fast forward to now, there's a whole building full of scientists operating at Mammoth Hot Springs. And they have a really beautiful glossy journal called Yellowstone Science, which is edited and published not for scientists alone, but for the common reader. It's really quite understandable and beautiful to publish in. And there are many, many academic researchers in the parks. I always used to say as a ranger that the problem with working, for the parks was that it was run by the government. But I do not believe that there is a private entity that could do what we do in the public interest. It's not perfect, but we've come a long way in basing decisions on science, I think would be the answer to your question. And I'm hopeful about it. What we're facing now is unknown to everybody. What I saw, and I think one of the reasons why I wrote this book was that I saw in front of me a time in which people were seeing such changes, human-caused changes, that they would stop believing in naturalness. And there are people who have. Some of you have heard of this book by Emma Maris called Rambunctious Garden, which basically says, look, we've altered everything. Let's just admit that we're sort of godlike now and step in and run this thing. Let's not be coy and stand aside and believe nature is autonomous. I don't happen to feel that way. To me, and I will say that I think Starker was right, that if things get out of whack, you do have to restore and manipulate things back into line. But that doesn't make us the engineers of the whole Earth. I think to imagine that we're capable of operating ecosystems, most of the things that we've done, were accidents, right? The fact that we took over the carbon cycle was an accident. The fact that we took over the nitrogen cycle was an accident. So to imagine that we're now somehow qualified to operate the Earth is like saying that if you get into a traffic collision, you're now certified to be a traffic safety engineer. I mean, I don't believe that's so. I don't think we're there. I think our hope is to restore and maintain whatever robust homeostasis is still present and protect all the parts. Aldo Leopold said the first law of tinkering is, if you take apart a clock, don't throw away the parts. Any other? Yes, sir.
Catastrophic fires in terms of
So that's a really interesting question. The gentleman asks, what would be my plan for catastrophic fire in terms of replanting and revegetation? Since we were talking about Yellowstone, everybody who's been there knows that Yellowstone was covered with a lot of things like lodgepole pine that were pretty well adapted to being burned once in a while. They have a fire return interval, a stand replacement fire return interval of somewhere 150, 250 years, and they've done a very admirable job of replanting themselves. I am not a forester, and I'm not an expert on this subject, but I do think that running a national park is different than running a tree plantation, and that I think we always have to ask the questions that I'm asking in this book. How much do we know? How how much should we reach in? How much should we be reticent to reach in? And in a national park, we should, as much as possible, allow the processes that still work to work, and don't take them over when it's not necessary, I would say. With that said, as I say in the end of the book, there's an effort now in Glacier National Park. As you know, the white pine blister rust, which came to the United States from first Asia through Europe around the turn of the century, has killed off a lot of the beautiful, high altitude twisted white bark pines and limber pines, and the Park Service has become involved with the Forest Service in an effort to select seed of rust-resistant pines, propagate them at a nursery, and go out and plant these in what amounts to a wilderness area. So there are things going on right now that I think the people at one time would have said, "Oh, you're way too deep into it," and they've become more commonplace now. So I hope I've answered you. Not really, right? But these are some thoughts I have. Let's say that. Thank you, Nancy. Do you want me to hand you a microphone?
So I'm wondering if you miss being a park ranger, and if you encourage.
Well, I think the best Nancy's question, Nancy McLaughlin's question is that do I miss being a park ranger, and do you think we're doing enough to encourage younger people to go into that work? I think the nicest thing we could do to encourage people to go into that work is have better funding for the National Park Service, and it's 413 now units. It keeps getting more units, but over the period from about the 1980s onward, we keep cutting it, and so the Park Service keeps getting involved in all kinds of trying to reach for money in other ways by having private entities take over their visitor centers and so on. And I think the best way to encourage younger people to go into this trade is to create jobs for them. It's as far as I do miss it sometimes, but I took up writing because I wanted to have a big campfire talk, larger than an outdoor amphitheater, with the general public. And I'm serious about that. It happened to me. I probably always wanted to be a writer, but what happened was that I started reading about climate change in about 1986. And it literally kind of took the wind out of my sails. I always had this idea, that I was a person who was willing to stand on a piece of ground with a badge and a gun and give up my life to protect nature. But you really can't shoot the atmosphere, and you can't handcuff it. And so I think at that point, by the end of the 80s, I had decided that writing would be a sort of campfire talk I would have with the public. And I'm enjoying it, and I started out to write about nature, and I've become fascinated with people. And really what the critics are saying about this book is often about the characters. I've tried to take these people who I'm fascinated with and deeply research them, go over, whether it's little clips of movies of them walking. When Frank Craighead walks up the aisle to testify, Frank had a particular cat-like grace. Frank was a really athletic man, about 5'7". Both these brothers are little wrestlers. They were college wrestlers. And when they walked, I watched a lot of movies of them walking, and they just had this sort of cat-like grace, So I really tried to make these people live because they're alive in my mind. Harry's alive. I've become very involved with his family, We've started working on raising money for a land trust to save farms in Alabama and Georgia. Any other questions? I'm mindful of the time. Yes, sir.
In the context of wilderness areas,
I get that question a lot, and I think a lot of people now have been exposed to the idea that it turned out that nature, when the parks were made, it wasn't a sort of tabula rasa. It wasn't, the native wilderness as it had been since time immemorial. It was to some extent a managed environment by Native Americans. And I think a lot of you have been exposed to this idea called the overkill hypothesis, which basically says that for some reason at the end of the Ice Age, you have 32 whole genera of animals, mammals disappear, At the same moment that the what's called the Clovis tradition people come marching over from Asia, they show up just at the moment that all these animals disappear. And the inference is that human beings came over here, the animals had never seen a biped, and they more or less had a party and ate a lot and killed off a bunch of animals. We also know about Indian fire. Fire was used extensively to modify habitat, to make it better hunting, to improve access, and for other reasons. So the answer is that native people were part of the biota of post-Pleistocene life here, and that we don't know everything we should know about their role in the predator suite, along with cougars and wolves and other animals that worked in predation. We do know a fair amount now about their fire activities, and in some areas they're trying to restore Indian fire. But I think that there are false equivalencies created sometimes. I'll try to draw this to a close, but there's some false equivalencies being made that, okay, well, the kind of things we're doing went back to the beginning, right? That an Indian with a brand of burning who's lighting grass is equivalent to a drill rig or a strip mine or a clear cut, or other things like that. And I think there's an order of magnitude difference in what we're doing right now to what they were doing. We do have a tremendous loss in North America of what they could have told us about the backstory of these ecosystems, and we're trying to parse out what we don't know, looking backward. I think they're going to kick me out now. I'd be happy to talk with you. When I sit and sign books, I'd be happy to talk with you outside. I'll stay as long as you want. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we will have the book signing going on right out here. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you in November at our next event. Excellent.
Jordan Fisher Smith's been a friend of mine for about 20 years, friendly, confidant, and he was there for me in the beginning.